Okay, so today we're going to deep dive into something you all wanted to hear more about, degrowth.
Yeah.
And we've got some really fascinating material that looks back at the COVID-19 pandemic
Right.
as like this kind of unexpected glimpse into what a world without constant growth could potentially look like.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to figure out what this whole degrowth thing means, especially for like a huge economic bloc like the EU.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
And really what it can mean for all of us in terms of redefining what it means to be prosperous.
exactly. The pandemic was kind of in a way, a sudden, almost like overnight demonstration of how much society can actually change and adapt when it's not fixated on just like constant growth. It was a really stark example, and I think gives us a lot to think about in terms of the potential for this degrowth idea.
Yeah.
What were your big takeaways from that period, thinking about how our economy usually works?
Well, I mean, it really made you stop and think, like, what do we actually need?
Yeah.
What's actually essential?
Yeah.
And, but what also really jumped out at me from the stuff we've been looking at is just how deeply ingrained this idea of growth is, in everything. Like our whole society, our institutions are all built on this assumption that we just got to keep growing forever.
Mm-hmm.
And the EU, with its whole history of like economic integration and expansion, it seems like a perfect example of that.
For sure. I mean, the EU's foundation is built on the idea that more economic growth equals more prosperity.
Right.
For everyone. So to intentionally step away from that is, it's more than just an economic shift. It's a big political and social challenge too. The degrowth really asks us to like fundamentally re-examine our values and start prioritizing well-being and the health of the planet over just accumulating more and more stuff.
Right.
It really challenges the idea that bigger is always better.
Okay. So then degrowth isn't just about like a recession or a downturn.
Yeah.
It's like conscious decision to move in a different direction.
Yeah.
And the material we're looking at kind of suggests that this growth at all costs mindset might actually be creating the problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the pandemic really exposed a lot of the flaws in the way our current economic system works,
Right.
And it underscored just how urgently we need a new approach.
Okay. So what would that look like?
Well, this new political economy that we're talking about would have to focus on things like redistribution, making sure resources are shared more fairly, ecological restoration,
Right.
Really healing the damage we've done to the planet, and then things like cooperation and sufficiency, which is about learning to live within our planet's limits.
So how does all of this play out for the EU specifically?
Right. Yeah.
Especially with things like the Green Deal, which, it's about sustainability, but it still seems to operate within that growth paradigm.
Yeah, that's a real tension that they're going to have to grapple with,
Yeah.
The EU wants to be sustainable, but they're also focused on economic recovery and making sure that all the different regions are developing at a similar pace.
Right.
And degrowth could complicate that because if it's not done carefully, it could actually create new inequalities.
Interesting.
Yeah. For example, the EU's common agricultural policy, right now it's mostly about giving subsidies to farmers to produce more food.
Right.
But in a degrowth model, you might see a shift towards incentivizing ecological restoration instead.
Okay.
And the single market, which is all about free trade across the EU, might start prioritizing local needs over just having everything flow freely all over Europe.
That makes a lot of sense. So if we're not just focused on getting more stuff, how does degrowth change what we think of as a good life?
Well, it's really interesting because the whole idea of prosperity shifts from measuring how much we consume to how well off our communities are and how healthy the environment is. So it becomes less about, constantly buying new things and more about having strong social connections, and investing in personal development.
Yeah.
And living on a healthy planet. And the other thing is that the pandemic really showed us that people are capable of incredible compassion and resilience. There was this huge outpouring of altruism that, maybe could be the foundation for a post-growth society.
And a more cooperative model?
Exactly.
So then how do organizations fit into this whole picture?
Yeah.
If growth isn't the primary goal, what is?
That's a really key question. I think organizations would have to start prioritizing things like social and ecological value over just maximizing profits and market share.
Right.
Think about the car industry in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
They're moving towards electric vehicles, which is a good step.
Right.
But a true degrowth approach might mean producing fewer cars overall and investing more in public transportation.
Interesting.
And that would require a big shift in how those companies think about their role. But ultimately, I think degrowth gives us a framework for imagining a future that's more just and sustainable.
Yeah.
It's a way to challenge the stories we tell ourselves about progress and create real possibilities for transforming society and our relationship with the planet.
So the big takeaway here is that degrowth really is this fundamental challenge to the way we've organized our society and how we define success.
Yes.
And it poses some really complex questions, especially for a major economic power like the EU.
Exactly. And here's a final thought for everyone listening.
Okay.
How do you think your own personal aspirations and the structures of the organizations that you're familiar with, how would they need to change if degrowth actually started to take hold?
Right.
What aspects of life that we maybe undervalue now might become more central to our idea of what it means to be successful and prosperous?
That's a great question.
Yeah, something to think about.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into degrowth.
Yeah, this is a good one.
It's a fascinating topic.
Lots to ponder. Thanks for listening, everybody.
See ya.
Catch you next time.
Bye.